Hi, this is Goff of gofflowy.com with reliving the dial-up internet experience in 2020. So I didn't make any noise during the whole startup process. That way we could experience the full sound and nostalgia of dialing up to the internet. So we've got a 31.2k connection. 56k is not possible because of the analog nature of the connection, and I'm firing up Netscape Communicator 4.8 under Windows 98 SE. So as we begin, the first thing it's going to do is connect to my internal mini proxy, and I'll show you why I've got this in just a sec. But let's say we try to visit a modern site like Slashdot. And what you'll find is that with the changes in HTTPS protocols and TLS protocols, it's not possible to negotiate a common cipher. So connections to HTTPS are impossible. And given the prevalence of HTTPS nowadays, it's basically not a possibility to visit any modern site directly. So instead, using mini proxy, I've got a Asus Tinkerboard who will connect to the site in HTTPS, download the content, and basically send it back to us with all the links rewritten so as to go through the proxy. So right now, you can see the bottom, it's flickering away. But another thing we will notice is that web browsing technology has advanced quite dramatically over the years, and same with the HTML standards. Things like CSS and certain sorts of JavaScript were not around at the time that Netscape Navigator was, so the site loads up, but it looks very different from how you would experience it today in a modern browser. Of course, being dial-up at 31.2k with the images and the text, it will take a while to download, and so I think we need to be perhaps a little bit more grateful for the amount of bandwidth that we have nowadays, and how quickly the internet responds. If anything, the internet is the savior of everyone working from home nowadays. So this is pretty cool. Let's go to the Bureau of Meteorology, the agency for weather in Australia. They're one of the few sites which I know still operate in pure HTTP mode. Always cool to look at the Netscape Meteor icon in the top corner. Okay, so let's grab the Sydney forecast. Again, things don't look as you might expect on a modern web browser, again due to the lack of CSS and JavaScript support. So yeah, you can see occasional JavaScript errors in the bottom, but always nice to look at that progress bar blinking away at the bottom with status updates, as well as a sort of smooth, gentle going back and forth. I remember as a kid when I was using Netscape at my primary school, back then it was on a 28.8k modem connection, things would load a lot quicker because websites were nowhere near as advanced and content heavy as they are today. And that indicator would just continually flicker with status updates, and we'd have MIDI music, colored backgrounds, scrolling text, and whatnot. Let's see what happens when we go to google.com. Oddly enough, Google, being quite an advanced site, still seems to cater for old web browsers, at least to some extent. It doesn't render perfectly, but at least it does load. So let's also take a gander over to Wikipedia now. HTTPS is used on Wikipedia, so again it has to go via the proxy. And let's see how long this takes to load. So in this video I've decided to have all the loading segments in real time, so you will be waiting exactly as long as you would expect on a 31.2k connection. There is a little bit of benefit from the compression, the v42 bis compression on the modem link, but that's about it in terms of throughput enhancements. Unlike modern browsers, there's no gzip support in Netscape, or at least not to my knowledge. But that's okay because I guess v42 bis will do a not as good job, but still a decent job at compressing text. So you will notice that the video does have a few cuts in it, and those cuts are mainly just to cut out attempts at loading websites that went wrong or otherwise didn't render it at all. And that's not a big surprise if you try to use an old web browser on modern websites, that things just seem broken, out of place, missing perhaps, and sometimes the functionality just doesn't work. And part of the reason is not only because of the web browser, but also because of the way Mini-Proxy is working. It's trying to rewrite all those links so that they do go through the proxy. In case you're wondering, I've just added a static bind for pr.oxy to my main router, which is why I can get to my Tinkerboard just by typing in pr.oxy. It's a nice shortcut to have. Anyway, it says Wikipedia is loaded now, and yeah, it's a pretty Spartan main page. What happened to my main article? Where's the search? Well, seeing that we're at Wikipedia, I think the most useful page to load now would probably be the one for Netscape. You might notice some of those mouse movements not being so smooth. This is because I am capturing the video output from the TechWay Endeavour 2 via a VGA to HDMI adapter, and then via an AverMedia Live Gamer portable HDMI capture card, and so there's a bit of latency, and it's absolutely difficult to time my mouse movements under this situation, looking at it through the preview window. But lo and behold, the article for Netscape in 2020. How awesome is this? Yeah, Netscape is quite long gone, I suppose, defunct 2003 according to the article, but it kind of lives on in Mozilla Firefox. Unfortunately, Firefox is not as popular as it once was, but needless to say, I am a Firefox user. I still am a Firefox user today. I don't really like Chrome as much as I do Firefox, so I guess in some ways I'm still using Netscape, just not real Netscape, I suppose. But there was a time when Netscape was the dominant browser, and in fact it was the only browser. But let's take a look at what someone else who joined the internet a little bit later might be using, the dreaded Internet Explorer. In this case, this is IE 5.5 SP1, if I recall correctly, also running under the same Windows 98 SE environment. I'm just going to stop this, but basically we'll find that a lot of the default home pages won't load because, well, they're not there anymore. But let's see what happens now. This being a slightly more modern browser should support websites a little bit better than Netscape does. So, let me see. I think I fancy some comics, don't you? So let's visit XK City, one of my favorite comic sites, to see what this week's comic is. And needless to say, if you think webcomics were relatively easy and gentle in terms of their data requirements compared to the 31.2K connection we have here, I'd have to say we will be waiting a while for this comic. So maybe I should mention a little bit about why I was motivated to do this in the first place. After all, there'll be plenty of time. So I guess now with the COVID restrictions, everyone is at home, and we're relying on the internet more than ever to make that connectivity, to move our productivity, to have those virtual meetings, and sometimes it's easy to get lost in progress and not realizing where we've come from. So when I grew up in the early days of the internet, it kind of looked like this. Things moved very slowly, perhaps not as slowly as they do in this video, but they did move slowly. We had to be patient, and bandwidth was a scarce resource that we needed to conserve and take care of. Nowadays, people with unlimited broadband plans just don't think twice. They sign up for a high-speed plan, video just streams through, and likewise real-time video and audio conferencing is now not considered something special, but back then it was not a possibility. And with the processing power being so slow, I mean, you can think of the whole computer here with just 32 megabytes of RAM. Some websites may have images which may decompress to more than the total amount of RAM in the computer. And likewise, the download time would be shocking and astonishing, to say the least. So even this monochromatic PNG image, you can see it's slowly loading, and in the old days you would have interlaced image encoding where it would just load a little bit blurry and then get clearer over time, but that's sort of fallen by the wayside now that connections have gotten so quick. So I guess in some sense I'm doing this because it would be good to look back and see how far we've gone, but also as a way to say, don't take your internet connection for granted. And in some cases, if your internet's feeling a bit slow, well, just be thankful that it's not as slow as it used to be. I bet your internet connection is probably a lot quicker than this. Also, I guess the other thing is to fulfill a little bit of a childhood dream in a sense. I've always wanted to be an ISP of some sort, and now I can say, yes, I am my own ISP because I'm serving internet to myself. Of course, via my own Windows 2000 professional server, via USB Connexent modem, via my own little telephone line emulation through a Linksys PAP2T VoIP adapter. It's quite an interesting experience. Here's another demonstration. Again, HTTPS will not load properly, again due to cipher problems. But in Internet Explorer, this is actually a little bit cryptic because the error is a DNS or cannot find server error rather than a negotiation error. So that tripped me up a little bit because I was thinking, is this a transient DNS fault or what's going on? Anyway, while /dot loads in IE6, I should probably mention why this connection is not 56K. So a lot of people in the late dial-up days would remember 56K connections being the bee's knees of dial-up internet. And so they might be wondering why I've only got a 31.2K connection in this era. Well, 56K modems rely on digital infrastructure at the terminating site, and unfortunately this equipment is not very common. I mean, I do have a Cisco 3800 series integrated service router and a few cards, but I still haven't been able to get the digital modems working. The main issue is that unless you have digital on one side of your link, the signal-to-noise ratio limitations of the phone line interface itself make it impossible to go above 33.6K. Now, we have basically a back-to-back call going through a VoIP ATA. The problem is that there is a bit of frequency roll-off and perhaps line impedance mismatches, and there could be a bit of imperfections in the line codecs, which means that 33.6K could be achievable in theory, but in the case of going through the ATA where the analog is digitized and then converted back into analog, that conversion process itself is lossy enough to affect the connection speed. Now, if you use a different ATA like the Zixel Prestige 2302R, which is another ATA that I have, you will only get, say, 26.4K, because depending on how well you tweak your line gains and whatnot, the connection speed will differ. Now, sometimes when you're connected and things aren't really moving, you just want to see whether you're still connected. So it's always nice to bring up that dial-up networking screen just to check that your bytes received and bytes sent are still ticking over. And in this case it is, so there is actually activity going on. Being Internet Explorer, there's that spinning globe animation with the Windows logo in it. That is another classic display. Very nostalgic and very memorable, but already we can see that the /dot site is perhaps rendering a little bit better than in Netscape. At least we've got our grey background, but what about the content? It's probably going to take a little while. Some of that is probably not necessarily only due to transmission time. Some of that is also probably because of processing, because this is a original Pentium 100 megahertz CPU without the MMX extensions. And so if we think about this from a computational power standpoint, this CPU is probably weaker than the cheapest budget smartphone you can buy today. And likewise, the 32 meg of RAM doesn't really cut it either. And when it runs out of RAM and decides to swap to the hard disk, the 2.1 gigabyte 2.6 gigabyte Fujitsu IDE hard disk doesn't really have that much of throughput. In fact, a cheap USB 2 memory stick probably has more sequential throughput and faster random throughput than the hard drive does. Another common dialogue in Microsoft Internet Explorer, that one regarding privacy and cookies. Quite pertinent given the whole GDPR thing as of recent, but back then there were there were utilities that you could install that could clear out your cookies periodically to stop tracking, to save some disk space, etc., etc. But yeah, this is starting to look a bit more like the modern Slashdot. Yeah, it's still not perfect, but it certainly looks a little bit better than in Netscape. As you can tell, scrolling is taxing the computer a little bit, which is no big surprise because I think the last time that I looked, the cache speed on the Pentium CPU is only, I think, 128 megabytes per second, which it's quite amazing to think that every modern SSD is faster. In fact, some hard disks are faster in sequential throughput than the cache on this CPU. Anyway, so I do have a file server on my Asus Tinkerboard, and I have this file server loaded up with software which can be installed on older versions of Windows. This is just a convenience for me. Let's say we want WinRAR 2.8. Let's have a download of that and see how long it takes. It's a 620 kilobyte file. We'll just hit save and just save it to the desktop. Nothing special, not using the download manager like FlashGet, which you might have used in the old days, just to resume your downloads if your connection broke. But we can see this old familiar downloading screen where you can see the file kind of moving from the globe to the folder and that progress bar. And I remember waiting at this screen for many hours, it must have been, or even days, downloading large executable files just to update software on the computer or just to get new software. And so this was a common sight, but it was perhaps, a misguided thing if you were using this to download very large files, because sometimes it just wouldn't resume if the connection broke and you dialed it back up. You just click the same link again, and if it chose to resume, you'd find that the bar would very quickly move up to where your progress kind of ended. But when it chose not to resume, or if you're downloading servers that didn't support partial ranges, then you were stuck starting from the beginning. But I mean, I guess we have a lot to thank browsers for. Modern browsers have a lot more functionality than older browsers do. For example, in Firefox nowadays, it is possible to pause and resume downloads. Of course, it's not going to be quite as snappy as a download manager with multi-threading, but I mean, it's integrated into the browser and it's quite convenient. So the transfer rate average is shown at the bottom. It's about 3 and a bit kilobytes per second, which is about 26 kilobits per second, let's say, just roughly off the top of my head. Of course, there is overheads because of the IP packetization and because of the fact that over dial-up links, the maximum transmission unit is 576 bytes from memory. And so unlike, say, modern Ethernet connections, often if you're connected via a direct Ethernet link, you could have 1500 byte packets. If you're connected via PPPoE, say over an ADSL2 connection, you could get 1492 byte packets. So you are paying a bit more of an overhead cost on dial-up because you are sending those headers so frequently. But that was necessary because even a 576 byte MTU packet would take a significant amount of time to traverse the phone line, and in case that the packet was damaged and needed to be retransmitted, you didn't want to have to lose too much time or progress. And not only that, the computational capabilities of computers at the time were more limited, say with RAM in the networking stack. So a small MTU was pretty much the go back then. As we can see, the download speed will vary slightly because sometimes some parts are more compressible, other times parts are less compressible. Line noise, for example, and issues with the phone line could cause the modems to retrain and renegotiate a connection, often falling back in speed, but also holding the connection for maybe up to 30 seconds as the modems renegotiated. That was always a risky time. You would just sit there and nothing would happen, and you're wondering whether the modem would hang up on you or not. But okay, finally we have WinRAR in 3 minutes and 27 seconds. Go and download WinRAR right now, and I bet you it's going to take, tens of seconds for most of you. Okay, so now that basically ends our dial-up session for today. I've been connected for a while, as you can see. You haven't seen all of it, but yeah, once you're done with your dial-up connection, you hit disconnect, the DUN icon disappears, and you can shut down your computer. And this is pre-ATX days, so someone actually has to push a button. So hope you enjoyed this video. Hope it was a bit nostalgic for you, and thanks for watching.